And that's the part almost everybody misses. This song is not a song about chaos. It's a song about a person who has trained themselves to survive by pretending chaos is comfortable. Stay with me, because once you see it, you can't unhear it. Most people hear the opening line and think this is a party anthem. Fuel and brain chemistry, fame and fantasy, tossed off in one breath like a shopping list of vices. It sounds like a flex. It sounds like someone bragging about how numb they become, how used to the noise they are, how none of it phases them anymore. That's the surface read, and honestly, it's an easy one to land on because the delivery is casual, almost bored, like she's reciting ingredients rather than confessing anything. The hook repeats that phrase about calling all of this normal. And if you're only half listening, you'll take that as swagger. Look at me unbothered, living my chaotic little life. Ha! Isn't that just how it is? But listen to what she actually pairs with the word normal. She doesn't say it's good. She doesn't say it's fine. She says we call it that. That's not a description. That's a label somebody assigns after the fact. A story told to make an unbearable thing sound survivable. There's a massive difference between something being normal and something being called normal. And the entire emotional architecture of this track sits inside that gap. The first time you hear the hook, it plays like confidence. By the end of the song, once you've heard everything sandwiched in between, that exact same line reads like a coping mechanism dressed up as a personality. So let's break down that opening verse properly, because every single pairing in it is doing double duty. She opens with two words that shouldn't belong in the same sentence. Something flammable and something neurological. One is combustion, the thing that destroys, and the other is the brain's own reward chemical, the thing that makes destruction feel good in the moment is happening. That's not a random rhyme scheme. That's her describing addiction in real time, except she's being vague enough about what the addiction actually is that you could apply it to fame, to relationships, to substances, to attention, to all of it at once. The genius of leaving it unspecified is that it becomes universal. She's not telling you what she's addicted to. She's telling you that the mechanism of addiction, feeling something artificially, and then needing more of that feeling, is the actual subject. Then she moves into fantasy and fame in the same breath as choice, and this is where people get twisted, because they hear the things we choose and assume she's owning it, taking responsibility, being accountable for her decisions. But notice the pivot that comes 2 lines later. She asked to be shown hate, shown love, asked to be made bulletproof. Those aren't the words of somebody in control of their choices. Those are the words of somebody begging an outside force. Fame, the public, the algorithm, a partner, anybody, to just do something to her so she can stop feeling exposed. Bulletproof doesn't mean strong. Bulletproof means armored because you're currently unarmored and it's terrifying. She is asking to be protected from a life she supposedly chose freely. That's the first crack in the confident surface. If you truly chose something and it made you happy, you wouldn't need to be made bulletproof against it. And right after that plea, the hook drops. We call this shit normal. See it now? It's not celebration. It's the exhale after admitting something too big to sit with. It's the sentence people say right after they've revealed too much of themselves. The deflection. The little laugh that says, please don't look at that too closely. Everyone's like this, right? Then the second half of the first verse goes even further. And this is a part almost every casual listener skips past, because it comes wrapped in a runaway metaphor that sounds like typical escapism language. She talks about running away, being out of sight, not knowing what she wants. On its own, sure, that's just restlessness. Could be anyone's Tuesday night thoughts. But pair it with the very next line, wishing for a single minute just to turn herself off, and the escapism stops being romantic and starts being clinical. People run away from places. She's not running from a place. She's running from her own operating system. Turning yourself off isn't the same as taking a break. Taking a break implies you'll come back refreshed. Turning off implies you are, in this moment, a machine that cannot stop running unless something external flips the switch, because internally, she doesn't have access to her own off button anymore. That's not tired. That's burnout at a level most people don't talk about publicly. Dressed in language casual enough to slide past the first listen. Then we hit the pre-chorus, and this is where the song stops being clever and starts being devastating, because this is where the metaphor she's building finally gets named directly. Heavy is the head when you're chasing something true. That's a rewrite of the old idea about the way of the crown, except she swaps power for truth, and that swap matters enormously. The classic saying is about the burden of leadership, the loneliness at the top. She's saying something colder. The burden isn't leadership, it's authenticity. Chasing what's real in a life engineered around fantasy and fame is the heaviest thing a person can carry, heavier than the fame itself. Read that again, because it flips the entire premise of the surface interpretation. This isn't a song about someone drowning in excess. It's a song about someone drowning in the search for what's actually true underneath the excess, and finding that search exhausting precisely because everyone around her keeps offering her curated colors instead of honest answers. Which brings us to the color line, and I want you to really sit with this one, because it's doing something structurally clever that a lot of listeners skate right past. She asks whether she'll be painted red or painted blue, whether someone will assign her one emotional temperature or the other, anger or sadness, heat or cold, villain or victim. Then she immediately undercuts both options by saying neither one is true. Two sides of a coin and neither side is real. That's not indecision. That's her naming out loud the exact trap that public perception puts people in. You're allowed to be one thing or the other thing, angry or hurting, cold or warm, but you are never allowed to be the actual complicated mixture of both. And whichever label sticks isn't even accurate. It's just whichever one people decided fit the narrative that week. The coin metaphor works because a coin only ever shows you one face at a time, even though both faces exist permanently, glued back to back, inseparable. She's saying, I contain both constantly, and you people keep flipping me like I'm a coin toss instead of a person. Then that pre-chorus ends with a question that flips the camera around onto the listener. Is it different for you? That's not rhetorical fluff to fill a bar. That's her breaking the fourth wall for one line to ask whether this bind, hate versus love, red versus blue, chosen fantasy versus desperate need to be protected from it, is something unique to a famous person's life, or whether it's actually just what being a person is, amplified by a spotlight but not fundamentally different in kind. And I'd argue the entire emotional way of the song hinges on you, the listener, quietly answering no. It's not different for me either, because most of us have felt that exact tension between the self we perform and the self underneath that we can't quite locate. Now here's where the song gets its most physically vivid, and physically vivid is the right way to describe it, because up until this point everything has been abstract, chemical, conceptual, fame, fantasy, coins, colors. Then suddenly she grounds in a body. She says these feelings make her feel things that are unusual, and she lives all of them fully, without editing them down, and then she places herself and those feelings up against a wall, on her knees. That image is doing something the rest of the song only gestures at. It's showing collapse, not metaphorical collapse, physical collapse, backed into a corner on the floor, the stutter on the last word, the way it trails and repeats like her voice is catching, isn't a vocal flourish for texture. It's the sound of someone whose composure is failing in real time, right there in the recording, and she lets you hear instead of smoothing it over. That's a deliberate choice. Plenty of artists would have cleaned that stutter up in post. She kept it, or the vocal take with it, and was chosen deliberately, because the imperfection is the evidence. It's the moment to mask the rest of the song, where it slips completely. So by the time the hook comes back around the second time, you should be hearing it completely differently than you did the first time it played. First time. Bravado, look how unbothered I am. Second time. Now that you've had the pre-chorus's coin confession and the wall and knees collapse sitting in your ears, it's closer to a mantra someone repeats to themselves to survive an evening. We call this shit normal isn't observation anymore. It's a survival phrase. It's what you tell yourself walking back into a room after you've just been on your knees against a wall and the one before it. Let's go into the second verse, because this is where the song stops hinting and starts explicitly dismantling its own opening thesis. And that dismantling is honestly the whole point of the track structure. The verse opens with a direct question aimed at nobody and everybody. How am I even supposed to feel? That's not a throwaway line. Questions like that, phrased exactly like that, tend to show up in songs and in real conversation at the exact moment someone realizes they've stopped trusting their own emotional instincts because they've been performing for so long that they've lost the thread of what's actually theirs. Then she tells you she used to believe she had a heart built out of steel, something armored, indestructible, and now she understands the truth. Some pain simply doesn't heal. Notice the tense work happening in that couplet. Used to think, now understand. That's not a static statement about how she feels today. That's a confession of a belief system collapsing in real time over the course of however long this song has existed for her privately before it ever became a track. The steel heart myth was armor she wore, probably built the same way that bulletproof plea in verse 1 asked for. And here in verse 2, she's telling you the armor cracked. And worse, she's telling you it was never actually steel to begin with. It just got called that the same way the chaos got called normal. And then she does something almost nobody catches on a casual listen, which is that she names the exact myth the entire hook has been running on. She says if everything were just happy, that wouldn't even be real. Sit with that sentence next to the hook's insistence that this is all normal. Those two ideas are in direct tension with each other, and I don't think that's an accident. I think it's the thesis of the whole song stated in plain language for anyone paying attention. The hook keeps insisting this chaotic cocktail of hate and love and fantasy, and fame is simply how things are, simply normal, nothing to see here. But verse 2 quietly tells you that unrelenting happiness would be the actual lie. That pain that doesn't fully heal is the realest thing in the entire song. More real than any of the numbing chemical cocktail from the opening. In other words, the normal from the hook and the real from the second verse are not the same thing. And she knows it, and she's letting you catch her knowing it. Then she describes breathing everything out over and over 1,000 times, like she's trying to physically expel something that keeps refilling itself no matter how many times she empties her lungs of it. That image, repeated exhaling that never actually clears the system, is one of the most accurate descriptions of chronic anxiety I've heard slipped into a pop lyric. Because anyone who's actually lived with it knows that breathing exercises don't cure the thing. They just manage it for the length of the exhale. And then it's back. And right after that, she draws a line that to me is the single most quietly devastating moment in the whole song. Normal and special are just labels, just lines somebody draws, nothing more substantial than that. That's her taking the hook's central word. The word the entire chorus repeats like a mantra, normal, and revealing it to be an empty container. It doesn't mean anything inherent. It's just a line drawn by whoever's doing the labeling that day. Same as the red or blue coin from verse 1. Normal isn't a fact. It's a decision other people make about you, or a decision you make about yourself out of exhaustion, so you can stop asking harder questions. Then that gorgeous, aching image. One deep sigh, and then it slips away, fades away, and whatever she was trying to hold on to refuses to stay no matter how tightly she grips it. That's grief language. Not necessarily grief for a person. Could be grief for a version of herself, grief for a feeling of safety, grief for anonymity, grief for the steel heart she used to believe she had. The specific object doesn't matter as much as the mechanism. She's telling you that the things she tries hardest to keep are exactly the things that won't stay, while the things she desperately wants gone, the chaos, the noise, the chemical cocktail, refuse to leave. That a cruel little inversion, and it's the emotional engine of everything that follows. And then the verse pivots into one of the most quietly brutal sections of the entire song. The part about being wanted, all of her, every piece. On paper that sounds romantic. Someone wanting all of you, but she immediately punctures it with a question that undoes the romance entirely. But what even is all of me? That's not rhetorical either. That's someone who's been so thoroughly split between a red version and a blue version, a public persona, and whatever's left underneath, that the concept of all of her has become genuinely unclear, even to her. You can't give someone all of yourself if you're not sure the whole self still exists as one coherent thing. This is a direct payoff of that coin metaphor from earlier. The coin only ever shows one face. If somebody demands both faces at once, demands a whole coin, spinning, undivided, she has to admit she doesn't know what that would even look like anymore, because she spent this entire song being flipped between two sides that were both described as untrue. Then immediately after that admission, she says part of herself is starting to haunt her, and she can hear what people are calling her, and she asks, almost desperately, what do you even want from me? That haunting line is key. A haunting implies something from the past that won't stay buried, something unresolved circling back. Combine that with hearing what she's being called by others, and you get a portrait of someone caught between an internal fracture, being haunted by pieces of her own identity she can't reconcile, and an external fracture being defined by whatever labels the outside world assigns her, red or blue, normal or not. Both pressures converge on that final question, want from me, which isn't really addressed to any one person. It's addressed to the audience, to fame itself, to the culture that demanded she be bulletproof and then punish her for having a dent. That question, what you want from me, is the emotional center of the entire song, and it's worth pausing on why it lands so hard. Verse 1 asks us to consider whether this bind is different for her than for us. Verse 2 answers that question implicitly by showing us that the specific texture of her bind, being consumed publicly while trying to locate a private self underneath, is one most listeners will never experience at that scale. But the underlying shape of the question, what do people actually want from me, when what they want keeps shifting and contradicting itself, is something almost everyone recognizes in their own life, at work, in families, in relationships. That's the widening the song does at exactly its most personal moment. It gets more specific to her circumstances and somehow becomes more universal at the same time, because specificity, rendered honestly, tends to do that. Now, let's talk about a counterpoint, because I think there's a reading of this song that pushes back against everything I've just laid out, and it deserves real consideration before I tell you why I don't think it holds up. The counter-argument goes like this. Maybe this isn't a song about the exhausting performance of fame at all. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just a song about a party, about a specific night out, kerosene and dopamine as literal stand-ins for alcohol and adrenaline, fantasy and fame as literal descriptions of a glamorous evening, the hate and love and bulletproof line, just describing the emotional whiplash of being drunk and reckless with somebody and the whole running away. Turn me off sentiment just being garden variety, hung over regret the morning after. Under that reading, the coin metaphor is about romantic ambiguity. Is he into me or not? And the wall and knees image is about a physical dance floor moment, not a psychological collapse. It's a plausible surface reading. And honestly, pop songs get written to work on exactly that literal level too, so that casual listeners who aren't looking for a thesis can still enjoy it as a bop. Here's why I don't think that reading survives contact with the second verse, though. A song about one wild night doesn't need the specific architecture of used to think, now understand. That's not hangover language. Hangover language is present tense, embarrassed, over by the afternoon. The steel heart line is retrospective on a much longer scale. It's the language of someone describing a belief they held for years finally breaking, not a belief about last night's decisions. Similarly, a song about one party wouldn't need to interrogate what all of me even means as a stable concept, because in a party hookup framing, all of me just means physical or emotional exclusivity, and that's not a confusing concept to define. People define it all the time in far less existential language. The fact that she has to stop and ask what all of me even refers to tells you the fracture is identity level, not relationship level. A one-night framing also doesn't explain why the hook insists 3 separate times by the song's end that none of this is actually normal. No, we don't call this normal. A triple negation stacked at the very close of the track, undoing the entire chorus that preceded it. If this were just a fun, messy night out, you wouldn't need to end the song by systematically revoking the word that titled your own chorus. So I think the party reading is real. It's there, it's the surface the song is built to be enjoyed on, and I don't think it's wrong exactly. I just think it's incomplete, the same way the whole Confident Chaos anthem reading of the opening hook is incomplete. The party is the costume. The identity collapse is what's wearing it. And that outro is worth lingering on properly, because structurally it's doing the most important reversal in the entire track. Every single time the hook appeared earlier in the song, it affirmed the phrase, we call this normal, stated plainly, no qualifier. By the very end, that affirmation gets replaced by repeated negation, no. We don't call this normal. Stacked 3 times in a row like she's trying to convince herself of the opposite of everything she spent the whole song insisting on. That's not an inconsistency in the songwriting. That's the entire point of the songwriting. The chorus you thought was the thesis was actually the symptom. The outro is the diagnosis. She spent 4 minutes performing acceptance of chaos as normal, and the final 30 seconds of the song quietly takes it back, admits that no, actually this isn't normal, we just call it that because the alternative, sitting with how not normal it actually is unbearable. This is where I think we're zooming out beyond just this one track, because this specific move Building a hook that sounds like acceptance and then structurally undoing that acceptance by the song's close is a pattern you'll find across a lot of music that deals honestly with fame, burnout, and the particular loneliness of being perceived constantly. Artists who've lived inside intense public attention tend to develop this exact lyrical habit. State the numbness as fact early, because stating it as fact is protective. It keeps you from having to sit in the vulnerability of naming it as pain. Then, once the song has done its job of sounding confident enough to release, to perform, to promote, slip the real admission in at the edges, in a pre-chorus aside, in a bridge, in an outro that almost nobody quotes back to you in interviews because it's not the catchy part. The catchy part is armor. The outro is the wound underneath the armor. And you only find it if you stay for the whole song instead of just clipping the hook for a short-form video. And honestly, that pattern isn't unique to musicians. It's just more visible in musicians because they're required to turn their internal state into a 3-minute commercial product on a schedule, whether they've actually processed anything or not. But the underlying human behavior, insisting something painful is normal because normalizing it is easier than confronting it. Asking what people even want from you because the demands keep shifting and contradicting each other. Believing you're armored until the exact moment life proves you weren't. Breathing something out 1,000 times because it keeps refilling no matter how many times you try to expel it. None of that requires fame to be true. Fame just puts a spotlight and a paycheck on a coping mechanism plenty of people run quietly, privately, with no audience at all. The coin with two false sides isn't a celebrity problem. It's what happened to anyone who's been asked by a boss, by a partner, by a parent, by an algorithm to be exactly one legible thing, angry or fine, strong or struggling, when the actual truth was always both constantly glued back to back. So here's the claim again, the one I open with, and I want you to hear it now with everything sitting underneath it. This was never a song about chaos being normal. It's a song about how normal becomes a word we reach for when the truth is too heavy to say out loud. And the entire track is a slow 4-minute unlearning of that word, ending in a whispered admission that no, actually, we don't call this normal. We just needed to, for a while, to survive saying it any other way. That's the sharp version. That's the whole thing, distilled. Normal was never the diagnosis. Normal was the anesthesia. And by the time the song lets that last chorus dissolve into denial, you realize you were never listening to someone who had accepted their chaos at all. You were listening to someone still, quietly, on their knees against a wall, try to convince themselves that this is just what life looks like, right before admitting, finally, that it isn't.